Osama bin Laden was an awful person who did terrible things. Therefore, it should come as no surprise when the CIA examined the hard drives recovered from his compound, they found awful things. When they dug deeper into what was actually on the hard drives, some surprising files were discovered. We now know Osama bin Laden was watching anime, playing video games, and exploring some of the more unsavory aspects of the internet. Get ready, because what you're about to discover on this terrorist's hard drive will shock and appall you. On May 2, 2011, a group of Navy SEALs infiltrated Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. During this heroic mission, 5 terrorists, including bin Laden himself and one of his sons, were killed. The Special Forces unit moved through the compound with precision, ensuring that even after they killed bin Laden, they extracted his body so it could be thrown into the ocean at a later date. This was done to keep fanatics from worshipping it. During this mission, the SEAL team secured several hard drives, flash drives, and computers that contained some pretty crazy things. The CIA released a large amount of the hard drive's contents to further enhance public understanding of Al-Qaeda. However, what the average person wasn't expecting was the enormous number of meme videos, crocheting tutorials, and odd pornographic choices that were contained on Osama bin Laden's hard drives. That being said, not everything was released to the public, as there were files used to locate other terrorist leaders and videos too gruesome to circulate to the public. All in all, around 470,000 digital files, amounting to 250 gigabytes of data, were secured from Osama bin Laden's hard drives, and each file was more surprising than the last. Obviously, you'd expect to find terrorist-related information on a terrorist's hard drive. And although the CIA likely didn't release most of the documentation relating to Al-Qaeda's plans and activities, they did release something pretty interesting. One of the documents on the hard drives was an Al-Qaeda recruitment form. This might seem odd. When you think of recruitment forms, you probably have a business or not-for-profit in mind, but it would seem that Al-Qaeda needed some kind of document to vet their recruits. However, unlike a traditional recruitment form, the questions found on Al-Qaeda's equivalent were unique to their line of work. Questions like, "Do you wish to execute a suicide operation?" were included in the application, along with less blunt questions like, "What are your favorite hobbies or pastimes?" It's unclear if the answers to these questions either qualified or disqualified a candidate from becoming a terrorist, but this is just one of the many documents that give us a glimpse into Al-Qaeda's vetting process and how the organization was run. Other terrorist-related information on the hard drives included videos and speeches of Osama's son, Hamza bin Laden. It was assumed that Hamza would take over the organization when his father either passed away or could no longer lead Al-Qaeda, so documentary footage was archived on the hard drives for historical purposes. Al-Qaeda also used these videos and images as propaganda to show Hamza would be a strong leader. However, the videos on the hard drive seemed to contradict the message. There was an hour-long wedding video on one of the hard drives, which droned on and seemed to have no real significance. Hamza is seen sporting a thin mustache and looking relatively unhappy throughout the whole thing. Images from the wedding were also used in some of the terrorist group's propaganda, but the footage was cut to portray Hamza in a positive light. Some of the images and videos on the hard drives were likely used to identify and locate Hamza. In 2019, Hamza was killed in a U.S. counterterrorism operation somewhere in Afghanistan or Pakistan. The hard drives also consisted of plans and preparations for the 10th anniversary of September 11th and ways to use the Arab Spring uprisings to Al-Qaeda's advantage. The information on Osama bin Laden's hard drives was not meant to be seen by anyone outside of Al-Qaeda, as they included details that would allow the U.S. to interrupt their plans. However, it's the things other than terrorist plots and speeches found on the hard drives that were the most shocking. It probably comes as no surprise that Osama bin Laden was a narcissist. His hard drive tells this story almost perfectly. This awful human loved documentaries about himself. In fact, his hard drives were loaded with shows such as CNN's In the Footsteps of Bin Laden and World's Most Wanted. It's plausible that these shows were downloaded just to keep tabs on what the US media knew about him, but there was also no reason to save the files after they were watched if that was the only thing they were being used for. It's not hard to imagine Osama bin Laden watching documentaries about himself and finding pleasure in them. This is a disgusting thought, but bin Laden was a disgusting man. He also had recordings of the 2008 documentary Where in the World is Osama bin Laden, created by Morgan Spurlock, the man who made Super Size Me. Perhaps the craziest documentary that Osama bin Laden had on his hard drive was Loose Change, which theorized that the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon was a false flag operation. The documentary has been debunked countless times and has no real evidence or validity to it. It's just odd that Osama bin Laden, the man who orchestrated the 9/11 attacks, would have a copy of this particular documentary on his hard drive. Maybe it was just a reminder of how gullible some people can be, or perhaps he kept it as a memento, just like all the other documentaries about him. We know bin Laden was crazy and super paranoid, and rightfully so, as he had the world's most powerful military looking for him constantly. However, a document on his hard drive showed just how nervous he was about being tracked down. In one folder, there were a set of messages from bin Laden to one of his wives. In it, he told the wife they'd put a tracking device in her filling when she went to a dentist in Iran. Osama described it as the size of the chip is about the length of a grain of wheat and the width of a fine piece of vermicelli. It's not entirely clear what bin Laden did about this paranoid delusion, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that he forced his wife to have the tooth removed. There's also no evidence that a tracking device was ever put into her tooth or if this was even possible at the time. As we go deeper into the hard drives of Osama bin Laden, things start to get stranger and stranger. For example, some of the porn he had on it wasn't the most conventional. Osama bin Laden was into some kinky stuff. On his hard drive were bootleg copies of obscure porn titles that came from old arcade games. For example, games like Fantasy 95 or Perestroika Girls rewarded players who progressed through the story with badly drawn pictures of naked or scantily clad anime women. These pictures were either pixelated characters or extremely low-resolution pictures of real nude women. It seems like an odd choice for porn. However, it wouldn't be uncharacteristic for Osama bin Laden to have strange tastes when it came to what interested him. That being said, some journalists believe that the pixelated porn might have been used to send coded messages to other members of al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was afraid of relaying messages via email as they might be tracked back to him. This was also probably not the most secure way of sending messages to his terrorist organization, especially if he didn't want the US to find out what his plans were. Therefore, it's hypothesized that he might have hidden secret orders or messages within the pornographic images or games that he had on his drive. But some experts have another hypothesis as to why bin Laden had so much pixelated porn on his hard drive. They say he might have just been into it. Osama bin Laden wasn't only into watching porn, there were also many other surprising videos, shows, and movies that were discovered on his hard drives. Think back to around 2007 and the meme videos that came out on YouTube. Perhaps the most famous of all was Charlie Bit My Finger.
Charlie bit me. Ah!
It was so popular that even Osama bin Laden saw it. When going through the files on his hard drives, the CIA was surprised to find that bin Laden had downloaded a lot of YouTube videos and even enjoyed watching the meme videos that were coming out of the US. There were numerous cat videos found on the hard drive, which might suggest that bin Laden was a cat person, or at least he found them amusing. One of the most surprising assortments of videos that bin Laden downloaded off the internet had nothing to do with terrorism or memes. Instead, he had a huge collection of crocheting videos. This might seem weird for a mass murderer and a leader of a terrorist organization, but when bin Laden was in hiding, there probably wasn't a whole lot to do. He might have taken up crocheting as a hobby and learned how to do various patterns using YouTube videos. For example, files like How to Crochet a Basket, Stripe Crochet Beanie Cap Hat, and Star Rainbow Crochet Applique were some of the numerous crocheting files found on bin Laden's hard drive. We aren't sure if he was the one doing all the crocheting, but someone in al-Qaeda had a real interest in knitting. The other part about the videos on Osama bin Laden's hard drive was that there were a number of educational videos for young children. Maybe these are what bin Laden used to learn English. Files like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, the new Fast Alphabet, ABC Phonics Chant, and 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe suggest that bin Laden struggled with his ABCs. In all fairness, the Arabic alphabet is different than the Latin alphabet, but the videos he chose to learn the ABCs from probably didn't have to be children's sing-along songs. Bin Laden also liked other documentaries besides just the ones that were about him. Yet, like everything else on his hard drive, there seemed to be some odd choices. Perhaps Osama bin Laden was looking for dirt on the Christian church, or maybe he just found scandals fascinating. But one of the many documentaries was Sex, Crimes, and the Vatican. Another file was titled How Many Angels Are There?, which could refer to a documentary about how many angels there are in heaven, or perhaps this was just a YouTube video that literally explained how many angels there were in the Quran or other holy writings. Osama bin Laden also enjoyed his cartoons. There were several episodes of Tom and Jerry along with the Pink Panther found on the hard drive, but perhaps the most intriguing video file of all is one that's titled Bubbles.wmv. Is this just a video of someone blowing bubbles? Is it about how to make bubbles? Or is it something else entirely? We may never know. There also appears to be a lot of anime fans at Osama bin Laden's compound, because large amounts of space on the hard drives was dedicated to anime shows. It might be hard to imagine Osama bin Laden and his terrorist friends sitting around watching anime, but the sheer number of videos on the hard drive suggests this is exactly what happened. Osama enjoyed Naruto, Bleach, and Dragon Ball Z. On top of that, there was also The Devil May Cry and a number of anime crossovers that only hardcore anime fans even knew existed. It's actually impressive how vast of an anime collection Osama bin Laden had on his drives. This also goes to show just how much pirating of copyrighted materials Al-Qaeda did. Copyright infringement probably isn't the most pressing concern for a terrorist organization, but it does mean someone in Al-Qaeda put a lot of time and effort into illegally procuring all of the anime videos, along with some other digital content. We'll never know if this was at the order of Osama bin Laden or if someone else in the organization took it upon themselves to load up the hard drives with anime, but the massive amount of files suggests it was likely being watched regularly. For someone who hated the Western world so much, bin Laden had a lot of Hollywood blockbusters on his hard drive. Animated movies like Ants, Cars, Ice Age, and Chicken Little were all found on the hard drives, but these weren't the only movies found. It would seem Osama and his crew were also into action flicks. The hard drives had files for Resident Evil, The Three Musketeers, and Batman Gotham Knight. Perhaps these were for research purposes, but it seems much more likely that Osama bin Laden and the terrorists that surrounded him just enjoyed watching the flicks that came from a part of the world they saw as the enemy. To be fair, there wasn't a whole lot to do in the compound while hiding from drones and US operatives that were hunting them down. Therefore, bin Laden needed a large number of entertainment options to keep himself busy. And what better way is there to kill the time than by playing hours upon hours of video games? It would seem Osama had a liking for Nintendo games. There were several emulators stored on the hard drives collected from the compound, and most of the files associated with them were for classic Nintendo DS games like Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, New Super Mario Bros., Metroid Prime Hunters, and Yoshi's Island DS. However, not all of the video games were based around Nintendo's fun-loving plumber and his friends. There was also a hardcore gamer side to things as well. Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars was another game on Osama's drive. Like with the DS games, there was an emulator installed for bin Laden to play to his heart's content. The Grand Theft Auto franchise seems much more in line with Osama bin Laden's personality, since he could kill innocent civilians and cause mayhem. You can imagine him playing until the wee hours of the night, trying to get away from the cops and wreaking havoc across Chinatown. Luckily, he wasn't able to get rid of his wanted status in the real world, and SEAL Team 6 took him out to ensure he'd never hurt anyone ever again. Just like Grand Theft Auto, another game on Osama's hard drives makes sense when you think about it. Members of Al-Qaeda and their leader had access to Counter-Strike, a first-person shooter where players work together either as terrorists trying to plant a bomb or counter-terrorist forces trying to stop them. We'll give you one guess which team Osama and his friends like to play on. The game normally requires an internet connection to play against other people across the world. However, bin Laden and the crew at the compound may have set up their own LAN network to play against one another. Again, it's probably pretty obvious which side Al-Qaeda members wanted to be on. The LAN network would have been more secure, so they couldn't be traced, which means if you ever played Counter-Strike back in the day, you probably didn't face off against Osama or members of Al-Qaeda, although we don't know that for sure. On top of the video games already mentioned, there seems to be a decent amount of time spent playing Zuma Deluxe to pass the time. You have to remember that around 2007, these types of games were all the rage. It's interesting to note that Osama and his group at the compound seemed pretty up to date with their gaming practices. These men also spent their time killing zombies in Sniper Elite Nazi Zombie Army 2. Many of the video games that Osama and the men in Al-Qaeda were playing had a shooting component to them. Again, this is not surprising considering who was doing the gaming. Even though these were bloodthirsty terrorists, it does seem they enjoyed Nintendo just as much as any of the shooters they had at their disposal. Again, we'll never know which games Osama bin Laden himself preferred or played, but according to the files on his hard drive, he seemed to be an avid gamer. Along with video games, porn, and other media, there was a plethora of documents housed on the hard drives. The important ones were never released to the public for national security reasons. However, we can assume that some of the files on the hard drives led to the capture or deaths of many other Al-Qaeda members. Also, it's likely that not too many photos and videos of torture victims and executions were released to the public. Let's not forget Osama bin Laden and the members of Al-Qaeda were terrible people, capable of unspeakable things. Even though you might have seen some of the videos or played some of the games on Osama's hard drive, it does not mean bin Laden was an average guy. He was a terrorist responsible for the deaths of thousands, making him more a monster than human. There were also drafts of emails found on Osama bin Laden's hard drives that provided glimpses into what he'd been up to during his years in hiding. He couldn't send emails or make phone calls from the compound because they likely would have been intercepted by US intelligence and given away his position. Therefore, bin Laden wrote emails that were uploaded to flash drives and brought by a courier to different internet cafes to be emailed out. The most surprising finding from these emails was that even while in hiding, Osama bin Laden still ran Al-Qaeda. Although he remained its figurehead while in hiding, he did need to give up some of his power to his second-in-command, Ayman al-Zawahiri. The files recovered from Osama bin Laden's hard drives indicated that he was still giving orders, being briefed on reports, and making religious rulings within the terrorist organization, all while in isolation at his compound. SEAL Team 6 recovered a lot of information during their raid on the compound while simultaneously taking Osama bin Laden out. We don't know how many people were actually living there, but it's reported that at least a few of his wives and several children were at the compound at the time of the operation. This brings us to an important point. Even though these hard drives collected from the compound likely had files that Osama used at some point, these devices could also have been used by other members of the family or by the soldiers staying at the compound with him. Therefore, all the movies, shows, video games, and porn might not have belonged specifically to Osama bin Laden. However, no matter which way you look at it, he almost certainly knew what was on the hard drives, and it's probable that most of the entertainment on the hard drives was for his own amusement and to keep himself busy. Not everything was digital at the compound either. Osama also had an interesting collection of books that gave further insight into how the maniac's mind worked. Surprisingly, Osama bin Laden was the owner of several books on the US. He had an interest in United States diplomacy tactics, which was made apparent by the books such as Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars, Noam Chomsky's Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies, and Robert Hopkins Miller's The US and Vietnam 1787 to 1941. These readings were likely used to help bin Laden understand his enemy and plot new ways to terrorize the free world. However, this begs the question, if Osama bin Laden was so against the United States and the Western world, why did he have so much media from those cultures on his drives? Why weren't the hard drives filled with movies, shows, and games from other parts of the world or even from the Middle East itself? It makes you wonder if consuming Western media was actually a way for Osama bin Laden to understand his enemy better, or if he had all these things on his hard drives because he actually enjoyed watching Chicken Little or YouTube meme videos like Charlie Bit My Finger. It's probably not worth anyone's time to try to understand the man that was Osama bin Laden. To get inside his mind would likely be walking into a nightmare filled with contradictions and atrocities. Instead, we can accept the fact that one of the worst men who ever lived enjoyed pixelated porn and crocheting. Like many evil individuals throughout history, Osama bin Laden had an eccentric side to him. He was definitely a narcissistic psychopath, but he couldn't help but consume American culture even though he hated it. The bottom line is that many of the things you'd expect to find on a terrorist hard drive were there, but many things you wouldn't expect to find on a terrorist hard drive were also there. Either way, the world's a better place without Osama bin Laden in it. Thank you, SEAL Team 6. Now watch how SEAL Team took down Osama bin Laden minute by minute, or check out why Osama bin Laden was buried at sea.